Hello again. Welcome back to the Revolution Blueprint. I'm Rob Iobi. This is my co-host. There we go. Today we are going to continue on talking, following the narrative of broken government. You know, we could spend weeks, months, years talking about all the elements of government that are broken, but today we're going to try to focus more on the judiciary branch of government, and that's both the national government, the federal government, and our state and local governments. Will has a lot of experience and background and knowledge of our judicial system. So, Will, why don't you go ahead and get us off?
So let me preface. Spent 10 years working at DOJ. Learned a lot there, but I learned a lot of what not to do too.
Mm-hmm.
But so let's go into what the judiciary is. Judiciary is the branch of government whose task is the authoritative adjudication of controversies over application of laws in specific situations. So whether there's a group, individuals, entities, governments, it is their responsibility and the charge of the judiciary to settle those matters. They settle those matters by what's applicable, by the applicable laws and statutes as they apply to the Constitution of the United States. And in some cases in state courts, the Constitution of their states. So I want to give people a little bit of a mental diagram.
Okay.
So if you get charged in we're gonna break this out, but charges in state courts and who can charge in states. We'll get to that, but I want to go. So you go to you have your criminal courts, your civilian courts, your in your state, right? You have a district court, you have a circuit court. Those cases, when those cases get adjudicated, then there's an appeal process. That appeal goes then to the state court of appeals or on some level of that court. Then it goes to the state Supreme Court. And after the state Supreme Court, it goes to a U.S. District Court. And at a U.S. District Court, then it goes to a U.S. Court of Appeals. And then after the U.S. Court of Appeals, then it goes to the United States Supreme Court. And in most cases, that gets settled at the district level. In federal court, they make the law, they make it so that it sets precedents for those laws to be applied nationally.
Most cases are settled in summary, too. You go to trial on the district court level. Right. And then if either side doesn't agree with the decision in summary, then it'll go to the appellate court, and that's where you can actually, introduce oral arguments. Absolutely. I know this because I'm filing a lawsuit, on behalf of the Revolution Blueprint. That's coming soon. I'll announce that soon.
You just did.
The content of the lawsuit, the subject of it.
Exactly, subject matter. So what a lot of people don't know is that there are district courts in every state. There are only 11 appellate jurisdictions in the country. So that means if your case in Maryland, it will go to the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals. Your case is in Atlanta, your case is going to go to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Mm-hmm. If your case is in Texas or Louisiana, your case is going to go to the 5th Circuit Court of Appeals. If your case is in California and it gets that appellate court is the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. And you hear a lot about the 9th Circuit.
Right.
So the bigger the state, the bigger the area that they cover, the more judges that they have on their benches. So the appellate courts are the courts that have the most judges. They usually have 7 to 9. Sometimes they have up to 15 judges that serve on the bench. And then that's where you get to, you can have an ad hoc, or you can have one judge make a decision, or you have the panel judges make a decision. That's usually at the district court and appellate level. So I wanted to give people that little bit of understanding where their cases go, how they go, how you can appeal it, where it gets appealed to.
All right, good. So now that we know the function of our judiciary,
and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right, the U.S. Supreme Court, right. So, and then no case automatically gets heard by the Supreme Court. I'll bust this word up every time, but the issue of writ of certiorari,
writ of certiorari.
You got it?
Nice.
Man, look, busted it all up. But, with that, I'm not always right, but I'm mostly right all the time. With that said, the Supreme Court, votes on which, cases to take up and what not to take up. And, one of the decisions that they decided, or cases they decided not to take up recently, was the Alex Jones lawsuit, where he was sued for, I guess there was a decision for over $1 billion for saying that Sandy Hook, he's entitled to freedom of speech, but even if you do make the claim that, his freedom of speech brought harm to someone, how does that rise to $1.1 or $1.3 billion worth of harm?
Right.
So it was literally a political crucifixion of Alex Jones, whether you agree with him or not. because he's a thorn in the side of government because, he speaks out against, corruption in the permanent bureaucracy, and he doesn't care about either party. So both parties can't stand him.
Well, you know what I think the frustrating.
Funny how they didn't take that case up.
Exactly, but I think the frustrating thing about the judiciary and what cases they do here, and I mean just up and down the board, is if someone speaks out against government, why are they labeled a troublemaker, or especially if everything that they're saying is true? And we see that in a lot of cases. We saw that with Charlie Kirk. We saw that with Alex Jones. We see it with a lot of other cases where if you speak out against government, you're labeled as a troublemaker. Right. You're labeled as an outsider. You're labeled as someone that was an instigator.
Right.
When the biggest thing and the biggest problem that we have is that a lot of our people don't know.
Right.
And I mean, a lot of people just don't know the court system. And then we can go to black, white, and red in that concept as well, as to why people don't know, how people don't know, and is it by design? Right. About what their rights are and what they have the right to do and can't do.
I mean, ever since we, created the Federal Department of Education, we've been dumbing down and reducing what we teach to, through K through 12 about constitutional rights. And, they changed history into social studies, and then it, became a social experiment and what have you. But, the generation that needs to come together to reclaim our government is the generation that was taught right. But even then, like, we've all adopted, false understandings of how our government is supposed to work. Right now we are living in an absolute state of judicial supremacy, where if the court rules a certain way, the entire country thinks that judge or that panel of judges or justices' decision is the end all. And that is absolutely not how our government was designed. Our republic was designed, I should say. A judge, we talked about this last week, right. With the judicial powers of Article 3 judicial powers, how it was interpreted and defined in one of the first landmark cases of our SCOTUS, and that was Marbury v. Madison, where it held that, Article 3 powers were interpreted or amounted to judicial review power. Judicial review power is the power to strike down unconstitutional laws. And when a judge strikes down an unconstitutional law, in their opinion or their ruling, they need to state what about that law, is in conflict or contradicts the Constitution. That's not what judges do. And then, when you have in appellate courts where you have panels of judges or justices, what you have is an opinion, majority opinion, and then you have a dissent. And even in the dissent, the dissenting opinion might argue that it is constitutional, and they need to make a constitutional case by referencing the part of the Constitution that this particular law actually, falls in line with. It brings us to Article 6, Clause 3, the Supremacy Clause. Congress has the power to make law pursuant to the Constitution. So if the law is not pursuant to the Constitution, then it's no law at all. So if a judge isn't following the Constitution, then ultimately the judge is violating their Article 6, Clause 3 oath to uphold the Constitution.
Can you talk about the oath for a second?
Yeah. So the Article 6, Clause 3 oath, this is one thing that, I bet if you ask, 100 people, the majority of them would get this wrong. They take the oath to uphold the Constitution, but it's who are they taking that oath to? They take that oath to the American people. The American people have all the power over government. It's established in our Declaration of Independence, and it can never be amended. And I'll recite it. Mm-hmm. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever they become destructive to these ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish that government. That is where our inalienable power over our government comes from. Mm-hmm. The hierarchy of power: God, people, states, national government. And that hierarchy is broken. I mean, it's shattered by...
In some cases, flipped upside down.
Entirely. And every cancer or every problem that we have in this country is the cancer of the two political parties that are controlling it and facilitating. They aren't the ones that are technically robbing us. They are facilitating the rape and pillage of our nation by the global bankers. Like, and I said this again last week. Like, it's not like the global banks put something on their bulletin board and go, look what we're stealing from America today.
That's right.
You know what I mean? But you have to be very, like, you just have to look at what's logical and what's reasonable to develop a logical, reasonable theory about what's going on.
Well, why do they think that nobody can be removed from the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I mean, the Federal Reserve has no constitutional power to exist. Here, good point. I got the 18 enumerated powers of government brought up. So, talk for a minute while I find it.
Well, look, so think about the Federal Reserve, right? Every wire transfer that you send, every single one goes through the Federal Reserve. Every wire transfer you send. Think about how many wire transfers people send. There's a reason for that. There's a tracking of all dollars, tracking of all money. And so those funds are then released from the reserve. The reserve is what controls, and a lot of people believe that is what controls the government, right? The Federal Reserve is what sets the interest rates, right? So what you pay on your credit card versus the interest that you get in your bank account. Those are two different things, right? It's all about the rule of 72. And so people that study the rule of 72 understand that that's the rate that banks make money. It's the rate that the country makes money, rate that the Federal Reserve makes money as well. So
the Federal Reserve was not constructed to profit off of our money. It would be a conflict of interest, but there's one of our future shows is coming. We're doing a lot of research on this, and I think I just identified with my financial expert that can come in and, I want him to poke holes in my research if we can. I really want to get to the bottom of it. So it's not about proving that, I'm just learning all this stuff. And what I'm learning is, and it's rocking my boat. It's rocking my boat. We have to put a stop to it. But before we get down that road, I want to come back to the enumerated power to Congress. It's Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. And it's to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard and weights and measures. Congress was enumerated power to coin money and regulate its value. They abdicate that responsibility when they created the Federal Reserve in 1913, and now that Federal Reserve, a quasi-private bank, is the one controlling our money and controlling its value and dictating our monetary policy. The Congress was within its constitutional boundaries to create the Treasury. So they can create an agency that the government controls to carry out its duties. So, that comes to Article, 1, Section 8, Clause 18, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So they have the power to create that Treasury, but they don't have the power to create an entity or delegate responsibility to an entity that is not under or part of our government. The Federal Reserve is a quasi-private bank, period. Its very existence is in violation to our Constitution. The very existence of the Federal Reserve, again, is the two political parties. They are the cancer. They facilitated, they created that Federal Reserve, and everything that the Federal Reserve does, they allow. The Federal Reserve has devalued our dollar by 90% since its creation. So when you look at devalue the dollar, like this is something that, I think just kind of flies over the head of most people.
Right.
Like we talk about inflation. Inflation means that the cost of something is going up. I think most of us understand that. But when you devalue,
more than ever these days.
When you devalue the dollar, it directly implies you need more dollars for acquisition of something. So when they flood, we've had 4 rounds or three to 4 rounds of quantitative easing since the housing bubble bust. So since the Obama administration inherited the housing market crash, I think it's 3 to maybe 4 rounds of quantitative easing where they've just put trillions of dollars into our economy. But the crazy part is when we get into that show about the Federal Reserve, what happened in that housing bubble was there was over 150 banks that had more than $1 billion in assets that existed within our country. And most of those banks were owned by private entities, whatever. But that housing crash amounted to Dodd-Frank. It brought us Dodd-Frank legislation, which amounted to a strict regulation on banks. And essentially, the mortgage paper that was all going into duress all came from money that was from Wall Street funds. So like if a major bank, and I don't want to state the name of a major bank, but if a major bank was lending money out in a mortgage, the money would come from Wall Street, from a fund down from Wall Street, through the bank, out to the street, back into the bank for underwriting, then back up, and it would be underwritten a second time to become a mortgage-backed security again. So the bank, in most cases, never, unless it's a credit union, never really was the capital reserve or held the capital reserves for that mortgage. It was like a pass-through. So when Dodd-Frank came into play, essentially what it did was it required that if a mortgage went in duress, like behind, the bank that originated the loan would now have to hold dollar for dollar the value of the mortgage. It would have to increase its capital holdings.
So which is toxic.
Right. So if a bank had $30 million of mortgages that were, I mean, in that time, like our economy just went, you know what I mean? So we can argue about whether or not it was by design. We're going to do that on a future show, and I'm going to prove that it was. But I'm not always right all the time, but I'm mostly right all the time. Whatever I said wrong that time, but anyway. So
let me jump in right there for a second, because I want people to kind of understand what that means in practice to them. So that means that when your bank forecloses on your property, right? The bank now has an REO system set up. It's called their real estate owned. All right. Banks don't like to own real estate. Right. So to them, it's toxic debt. So that money he was talking about, that goes back into the system. It's toxic debt to them, because now they're holding real estate that's not even
a foreclosure market. It's absolutely toxic debt.
Exactly. Right. It's toxic debt. Right. So when people see in their neighborhoods and they see these houses foreclosed and all that, understand that this is the process that property is going through, but also that mortgage is going through. Understand that there's a person attached to that. Right. So I wanted to jump in and say that part.
And with that, so when, with Dodd-Frank legislation, it required that the banks would have to increase their capital holdings by dollar for dollar for any distressed mortgage that they had. So if a bank had $30 million in distressed mortgages, they'd have to increase their holding requirements by that $30 million. And the law required if they couldn't do it, they would have to restructure their assets. So let's say a bank restructures its assets to meet that $30 million worth of additional holding requirements. The next thing you know, another $30 million goes distressed. So now the bank has to figure out how to get another $30 million into their, increase their holdings by another $30 million. And the ultimate, ending where it would culminate into is that if they couldn't meet the additional holding requirements and they couldn't restructure to get there, then the government would send in a cease desist and negotiate a buyout from a larger bank. Over 135 plus banks met their demise from that Dodd-Frank law. Just a coincidence here. The 26 major banks that were standing are all the downline banks of the global banking system. Now, these 26 banks are also considered qualified banks. Qualified banks means that they're qualified to receive direct money or increases to their balance sheets from the Federal Reserve. So when you have a round of quantitative easing, as we were just talking about, where the government, the Fed, is infusing $1 trillion into the economy, it's not the Treasury printing the money like you would think. They're adding $1 trillion to the balance sheets of these 26 banks. Then you have fractional reserve banking, which allows them to gross that up by 10. They've changed that law. Now there's not even a limit on it. So they gross it up by 10, and then they lend all that out to us, the American people. And then we have to pay exorbitant interest rates on that, or they're going to come take our shit if we don't pay for it. Right? But it was money that was created out of nowhere. It's backed by nothing. And it was created by our own Federal Reserve. Again, Congress has the power to coin money and regulate its value. The Federal Reserve, for them, delegating that power unconstitutionally to the Federal Reserve, and now the Federal Reserve, quasi-private bank, they're all profiting. I mean, they're basically, it is a, I don't even know what the word, how disgusting it is, but the Federal Reserve is supposed to be acting on behalf of us. So our government couldn't create money and then lend it out for a profit because they don't have the enumerated power to do that. But it's being done through the Federal Reserve
every day.
And then at the same time, here's another big one. This is what, where I'm getting too far.
Let me ask a question, Ron. Can you explain, let's explain the relationship between the Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury. Relationship between the Federal Reserve and U.S. The distinction, and then how the U.S. Treasury, a la which the IRS and how those constraints are configured, and then what that means with the Federal Reserve and how they relate and how they don't.
The United States Treasury Department should be doing every single thing that the Federal Reserve is doing. Yeah. We created a constitutional agency to do a job based on the enumerated powers to government. The Federal Reserve exists in complete conflict with that. They have no business whatsoever being involved in creating our money and
or
regulating our money. And it's worse than just the quantitative easing, because that's just a trillion here or a trillion there. It's again, I'm not always right, but I'm mostly right all the time. So it's 3 or 4 times, but it's definitely at least 3 times that we've had quantitative easing in the last 20 years, and no quantitative easing in the 230 years preceding that, right? So, and that's when you need to print more money and infuse it into government. That's just a direct indication that you have failed government. But so the worst part of this is that, we talked about constitutional government, the cost of constitutional government being about $2 trillion a year. And then the cost of unconstitutional government, where the government is spending in our budgets $4.5 trillion on things and causes that they have no constitutional authority or power to spend, to be involved in at all. And, with that said, so you have $4.5 trillion being exhausted in unconstitutional government. What we want to do is we want to get you to associate that 30 to 40 to 60 to 10, whatever, thousands of dollars per year that's being taken from your paycheck to that, because that's what they're doing.
That's where it's going.
Right. So imagine if they weren't spending 3 times the amount of money on unconstitutional government than what constitutional government actually cost us, then we should be able to pay far less in taxes. They're stealing from us while they're blatantly violating the supreme law of the land. But it gets worse. So when they spend that $4.5 trillion, they're taking in $2 trillion less than what they're spending. So that's called deficit spending. And in that deficit spending, essentially, the Treasury Department creates a special or Treasury bonds to, like that. That's how they borrow the money. And the Federal Reserve or the 26 qualified banks, the coincidence, those banks that are, the global banking downlines, they're the only entities that can acquire those treasuries. So they acquire those treasuries. On paper, it says that when those 26 banks acquire those treasuries from the Treasury Department, that it's supposed to go out into an open bond bidding market for investors and stock or whatever you'd have it to come acquire those bonds. It's not what happens at all. The Federal Reserve immediately acquires those bonds back from those 26 banks.
Yep.
There's something wrong with that. The only reason that those 26 banks are involved in it, so the Federal Reserve isn't acquiring the Treasury bonds directly from our Treasury. So when people say audit the Fed, what are they actually implying? So if you throw into your AI or your Google and try to find out how much Treasury bonds the Federal Reserve is actually holding at any given time, it's going to tell you 7 to 10 trillion. But you have politicians that are out on the floor of Congress getting their media sound bites saying that we shouldn't be borrowing money from China to pay Israel. We haven't borrowed money from China in over 20 years. Japan and China represent the largest foreign entities that own our debt. And they own roughly $2.1 trillion combined, with China owning the lion's share of that $2.1 trillion. We haven't borrowed from them in over 20 years. To my knowledge, I can't find anything that shows it. It just shows that debt, you can see that debt hasn't changed. And we've just been paying them interest on that debt all this time.
I was going to say the interest on it is crazy.
Yeah, but here's the thing though, I'm going to cut you off, but
no.
So I'm to follow this point. So if the Federal Reserve owns $10 trillion of these treasury bonds, if they're holding them, one could argue that, we've created $37 trillion worth of treasury bonds, or at least in the last 20 years, we've created almost $30 trillion worth of treasury bonds. Since 9/11 that's the big date in our history where everything was changed. But we'll get into that a little bit later. But imagine, even if just for a second you consider that they're just holding the 10 trillion. But some experts believe that it's 20 trillion or more. We do have treasury bonds that are mixed into all kinds of, 401k portfolios, and, people can buy treasury bonds. So I'm not suggesting that they have all of it, but $10 trillion in treasury bonds, is a lot of damn treasury bonds, right? So there's $30 trillion in treasury bonds, that's been created in the last 20 years or so. So now when you look to the budget, we are paying interest on the debt in the budget to the tune of $1.3 to $1.4 trillion per year. Even if it's just half of that is going to the treasury bonds that the Federal Reserve is holding, we have a giant conflict of interest going on here. How can the Federal Reserve be creating money on behalf of the American people and then charging the American people interest
on their own money?
On our own money. You know, and this is the thing that might get me 6 feet, a 6 foot dirt nap, but you know, I'm not an expert. I mean, my background is in finance. Like I own OB Financial Services, right? But I'm I'm not an expert in this kind of stuff at all. Like, you know what I mean? I think I might understand it more so like as I'm researching it, but there's a lot. And, you know, I'm going to continue to research it. We're going to find us, you know, an expert or two to come on and try to poke holes in the research, you know, on my findings, or maybe even, you know, come down with a hammer like, hey, you think you know something? It's much worse.
Well, let me give people an idea of what $30 trillion is. $30 trillion is 30 million millions.
Mm. Man.
Put that again. $30 trillion is 30 million millions. Put that in perspective. So understand that when we talk about $1 trillion, what are we talking about? We're talking about a million millions? A million millions?
Mm.
So this is the robbery that's taking place. This is what's happening. This is we talk about Grand Theft Auto. This is Grand Theft.
And this is like, so I'm going to tie this back to, you know, I guess the most dysfunctional part of our republic, our three branches of government, is our broken judiciary.
Judiciary.
Because the judiciary is the entity that you would expect to, you know, be the check on this kind of stuff. But if I filed a lawsuit tomorrow challenging the $4.5 trillion that the Congress is continuing to spend in the budgets on unconstitutional government, I'm not getting anywhere with that shit. The court's going to strike that down. And I have a concrete case. I could just list the powers and say all this spending does not comply with those powers. It would be an easy oral argument, but I wouldn't win it. And the reason I wouldn't win it is because the court is there to make you think that there's a check on this out of control government.
Right.
We have a permanent bureaucracy that what our system of government has amounted to is an absolute state of tyranny. There is no fixing this through the politicians and the political process, because it's the politicians and the political process that created the problems, every single one of them. And it's the cancer in all things of every single issue in this country. The Republican and the Democratic parties have hijacked they're private entities, just like the Federal Reserve, but they've hijacked every single political office from ocean to ocean. So when we talked last week about how the guarantee clause guarantees in the Constitution, it guarantees each state its own form of independent Republican government.
Sovereign.
That means that they're sovereign. We are sovereign states. I think everyone's heard that. I mean, it's unquestionable. They are supposed to be sovereign. But the national government, through all its overreach, through all its, you know, usurpation of state sovereignty, state powers, has turned it into a central government that is ruling everything. And the states have allowed that because the politicians that are elected into state governments, they get their campaign funds from the PACs and from the top down. And, you know, the Supreme Court gave us Citizens United, where it actually declared, you know, not in so many words, that corporations have a voice. And that opened up the floodgates, and we went from, you know, $100 million in an election cycle to billions of dollars being, you know, flying around in election cycles. You know, and to that end, you know, we've just proven with the Doge thing that all of this money that's going out to these NGOs and going out to universities, you know, we're seeing that these universities and the NGOs are donating money back to super PACs. The universities are donating money back. So our own tax dollars are being laundered out around back to their political campaigns.
Right.
This system is fucking broken. Pardon my language, but the word isn't strong enough. And this podcast is here to highlight it. And then we're going to come down with a hammer, because the solution is the ultimate, and it's the only solution that we can get to at this point. But, you know, with that said, the judiciary is so out of control, and it really irks the crap out of me when people just fall in line with a judge's decision like it's supposed to be the end all. And that's how we started this whole conversation.
Well, you know, and I'm gonna go to the definition of sovereignty.
There we go.
Sovereignty is the supreme power or freedom from external control over a body, politic, or an autonomous state. That's not me that said that. That's in Merriam-Webster. but that's Webster's definition of sovereignty. So when you look at the sovereignty of a state, and you look at so let's bring us today. Okay, when you have states that argue wherever they want the National Guard to come into their state and things like that, they have sovereignty. And I'm gonna give a parable in a second, but those states, the governors of those states, have sovereignty from the federal government. They're sovereign from the federal government. They're not a party to. They are an individual entity sovereign to their own jurisdiction. And that is where the lines get blurred. Because if you're aligned with a political party, let's say, for example, your party is now controlling the White House. Your party is in the White House right now. Your party is controlling Congress, or your party is controlling whatever part of the three branches of government. And I say three because the judiciary has been politicized. Mm-hmm. So
that's three co-equal branches.
They're
not even really co-equal. No. The judiciary is not really equal, but that's just a coin phrase. Yeah, right.
So when you look at that and you say, okay, now my governor can say, okay, I can send the National Guard into my own state, but can the federal government do that?
The federal government can, but it's for the purpose, but it's not an act or a power that the president actually has.
Right.
Congress has the power to call forth the militia. But then if you really want to get down to the brass tacks in this, the militia is not a regulated army of the state.
That's right.
You know what I mean? The militia is a well-regulated, coalition of people. But we've allowed them to declare the National Guard the militia, but that's
I think right. Today now you have, we as we grew up in Ghana, we always thought it's the National Guard as that. Mm-hmm. Now it's ICE, it's DHS, it's that. It becomes the Department of Homeland Security. Now there are a lot of people that feel that now is the new militia.
I mean, the Constitution requires that the executive branch of government protect. It's the constitutional duty of the executive to protect the states from invasion.
Right.
This country has been invaded. So the ICE, DHS, technically it's a function of government. It's an enumerated power of government, so it's a constitutional function of government. The Congress nor the president has the power to deploy or call forth the National Guard to fight crime inside of the states.
That part.
Right. But, I think there's a lot that's being missed in the actual purpose that the National Guard is serving when, they're saying that they're in there for crime because they're conflating what happened in D.C., where in D.C., that is under the national government, right? It's owned by, it's federal property. Right. So, I don't know, man. I feel like every governor should be calling up their National Guard and stomping out crime and throwing out all the, judges and district attorneys that are acting in bad behavior by letting people out. A $25,000 bail.
Yes.
If I wreck my car and seriously hurt somebody drinking and driving, I'll probably get a $50,000 bail.
Or no bail.
Right. Well, it depends, man. No bail. It depends on the demographic of the person standing in front of the court. If you got a list of crimes, like a rap sheet, you're the one that's getting out on a weak bail.
That's right.
But a guy that's got a job, who has something to lose, they're going to put a big bail on him. But in the case where, we have people that are constantly, being charged for crimes and released, it's almost like they want the repeat offenders back out on the street because it causes the chaos.
And let me take that to when we look at what happens now in a city like Baltimore or Detroit or Chicago. What happens in a lot of those cases, and the crimes haven't changed. The criminals got younger. And so now what you see a lot of juveniles and younger people, 12 to 18-year-olds. It used to be the 18 to 25-year-olds that were the issues. Now you're seeing the 12 to 18-year-olds who are getting out. And we'll get to that because that's some red, white, and black stuff.
Yeah, but they passed laws that will not allow that made it soft on juveniles that are committing felonies. So the juveniles can get away with committing felonies for minimal punishment. So now, you
carjack somebody.
Yeah. Well, now who's putting
carjack somebody? The police lock them up. All right. So you carjack someone. The police locks them up. They take them to what we call baby bookings, the juvenile justice center, and then they're home. Their parent comes pick them up, and they're back home, because that's a law that was passed in the state of Maryland. That's a law that's passed in other jurisdictions.
And they're passing the same law in states. And in this case, like if I'm running a crew in Park Heights, I'm putting my 13 and 14-year-old out there to do the dirty stuff.
Because I know I can go. I know they'll be home tomorrow.
Yeah, right. I'm putting them out there to hustle. You know what I mean? About there.
This is what happens. And we both.
They're destroying the lives of little kids, though.
Exactly.
But it's not bad enough that like the environment destroys their lives, but when you make it to the point to where now the I don't want to call them thugs or anything. Like there's good people in our cities, but the people that are selling all the drugs and shooting everybody up, I mean, they're the thugs. But now they're made it to the point to where they're the predators, on these young kids. When before the kids just had to stay clear of them and try not to get caught up in that bullshit. Now they're preying on them because they're useful.
And it's almost like what you do in a capitalist society. You look at where you can get the cheapest labor. So a lot of people that hired immigrants that came into the country, they said, well, I'm going to hire them because the labor is cheaper. Right. It's the same thing in the streets, right? The labor's cheaper the younger the kids are, right? The younger they are, they say, we just go get you a pair of Jordans or get you a chicken box and half a bag of dope and some loose ones, and you can go, and you too can be like me. You too can be a criminal just like me, right? And so those are some of the problems that we see. That's why we have, but then the judiciary now has been maligned to just say, well, we have sentencing guidelines, right? They have what's called sentencing guidelines. And this basically says, this is what you can sentence a person to based on this crime and the statute of this law. That's what that says. But then we got to a point where we had mandatory minimums. Remember that conversation about mandatory minimums? And they were talking about, well, if you do this crime, you can only get this sentence. Or if you are at this age, you can only get this charged with this crime. So that's why we have a lot of the problems. It starts and ends with the judiciary. The prosecutors can only prosecute you with a crime. But if the courts don't uphold that, then we're back to square one.
When you even go into it, like the laws that they create, the sentencing guidelines. I mean, there's probably not a jurisdiction in this country that doesn't the entirety of their criminal sentencing and their codes directly violates the Eighth Amendment. The Eighth Amendment holds that excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. For no excessive bail, courts can't set bail so high that it effectively detains the accused without justification, right? Then it goes further to say no excessive fines prevents the government from imposing fines that are disproportionate to the offense. And then the cruel and unusual punishments bars inhumane, degrading, or grossly disproportionate punishments. We talked about this before. If Will and I got into an argument and I called him, let's just say I called Will the N-word. Like, Will's going to punch me right in my face, And my face isn't going to be as pretty after that. But so if I bitch out and call the police and press charges on him, Will's facing 13 years for that. 13 years for punching me in the face because I was being an asshole. Like, I was the one that provoked it. Like, I deserve to get punched in the face for that. I mean, I think anybody would agree with that, right? You know what I mean? So if I didn't use the hard R, maybe you could slap me. You know what I mean? But either way, that is cruel and unusual punishment. That is 1,000% the harsh sentencing guidelines from the national government. The national government doesn't have an iota of power from the Constitution to prosecute a single, well, there's two crimes, but to sentence anyone to anything. So all that said, that in its entirety, the harsh punishments exist to be able to get plea convictions, to get people to plea to a conviction as an alternative to finding themselves guilty and being at the mercy of a judge and finding their whole life thrown away over punching some white guy in the face for calling you the N-word. You know what I mean? Like, it's that simple. I hate to put it in that context, but that's real. That's real shit.
That happens.
Right.
It probably happens every day at Fells Point.
The plea conviction is in direct conflict with the Constitution. Completely. There's no justification for it at all. The plea conviction came about in the early turn of the 20th century with when alcohol prohibition was in play. There were so many arrests for people violating the law that they couldn't prosecute them all. So they invented the plea conviction, which said, hey, you sign, we'll give you this little fine, and you just admit to guilt, and don't drink again.
That's right.
Smiley or whatever your name is. And what that has amounted to today is the government using it as a tool of threat.
That's right.
These cruel and unusual punishments that violate the Eighth Amendment are used as threat to get you to take a plea conviction. And there is no way, like this is almost at its entirety.
Especially when you're totally entitled to a jury trial.
Right.
It can only be tried by jury trial.
What do they call that? The playground to the prison pipeline.
Pipeline, yeah.
In our black communities. So when you have, you know more about this than me, but I grew up in the struggle, and I was part of this when I was young. So when you go out and get yourself into trouble, break some kind of stupid law, right? So the government comes at you and says, hey, you can do 5 years for this, or you take this plea conviction, and we'll give you a 1-year suspended jail sentence. Like you just felt like you got it's a public defender that you probably got going at because you don't understand law, you don't have the money for decent representation. The public defender's offices are so bogged down, they don't even have the capacity to go to trial, but for a small percentage of their cases. So with that said, you take the plea conviction, right? That plea conviction suspends. What the Constitution says is that all crimes, here, let me pull this up, just to read it directly to you.
Mm-hmm.
Article 3, Section 2, Clause 3. The trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury. Not you have a right to a jury. It shall be by jury. That means for the government to convict you of a crime, it has to be by a jury trial, period. Shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state where the said crimes shall have been committed, but when not committed within any state, the trial shall be at such place or places as the Congress may by law have directed. With that said, the plea conviction right here is a complete violation of the Constitution. Any trial that convicts somebody, every single person that's sitting in jail by way of a plea conviction has a legal constitutional argument to get themselves free from jail.
Yeah.
But we have a broken system. This system was created. They created this system in violation to the Constitution, so they're certainly not going to be the ones to drop the hammer and go, oh, this guy's right. You know what I mean? So, but with that said, this is a huge, like it has systemic outcomes to the black community.
Well, I'm glad you said
the poor community in general.
Yeah.
But I just want to give Will a chance to talk.
Really?
This is where he's good at.
I appreciate you, bro. So the thing is when you look at the devastation that has happened in the black community, and I mean devastation. You have generations. You have fathers that are in jail with their children, with their sons.
Man.
And so you look at the devastation of what happened in the 80s, crack cocaine and things that came and invaded a lot of cities, not just cities like Baltimore, all across the country. And so you had these cities invaded, and I use that word, right? Invaded.
Yeah, it was all with intent.
Right? And you see what has happened. And I mean, you could drive around some of these cities, and I'm a personalize this for a second because I get emotional about it, right? When you drive around a city like Baltimore and you see people that can barely stand up, and you see people that are bent over because of drugs, you know what I'm saying? And it is
somebody's
daughter,
horrific. Somebody's son,
mother,
somebody's
grandmother.
Yeah, it's bad, man.
And it's that point where you used to just see young people strung out on drugs. They were in their 20s and they were just getting high. Now you're seeing senior citizens out on the street prostituting. Selling drugs, drug addicts. All this is the derivative effect of laws that we passed in the 80s and the judiciary not doing anything about it, but giving out plea deals and saying, okay, Mr. Drug Dealer guy, you made $1 million a month off of killing people in our community. But we're gonna give you a 10-year sentence. We're gonna suspend all but 5, and you're gonna do 3 years, really, for all of that, all of the devastation that you caused. How many people have gotten those deals, right? We'll give you 5 years fed time. You're doing 5 years fed time. You come home and you do the same thing all over me because you already know I'm only going to get 5 years. Let me go make all the money I can and kill all the people that I can. And I'm going to go make my money and I'll be back home again. Same thing with what we're seeing in juvenile crime across the city, across the country. When you look at it, it is mostly in urban cities where you see these young people, mostly black kids, boys, I'll say mostly black boys, but then you have a huge increase in even the young girls that are involved in a lot of these criminal activity, right? They're doing carjackings. They're robbing people. You see them walk around. They walk around just like, they got a uniform just like ICE got a uniform. ICE walks around in the uniform and the mask. You see these kids walk around the same thing. They got the all black on. They got the shiesty mask on. It's the same thing. All of it's criminal though. All of it. So what does the judiciary do about it? Nothing. Because you have legislators that have passed laws that have codified all of this activity. They've codified all of it and said, okay, it's okay for you to do it. That's basically what they're saying. It's okay for you to do because we're going to let you go back home tomorrow. Someone commits a crime in a city like Baltimore, a kid, 13, 14 years old. They go and commit a crime, they're back home the next day. And they're back out doing it again. So when we pull up these rap sheets of something now, when something over time happens, now they've graduated from carjackings. Now they're killing people. Right? Now they're committing homicide. And then now we want to be reactive when 10 years later, that kid is now murdered someone. Mm-hmm. But then we look back and said, he had 15 charges prior to that y'all did absolutely nothing about. This is where the judiciary gets conflicted.
It's by design. It's by design. Like we talked about that last week when you said, why do they call it the projects? Because it was a project. Like, right. You know, how in the hell do we not openly call this segregation? When you take poor black people and you stick them into the projects, and then you under-police it, you allow crime to run rampant, you I'm going to say dumb down, but you basically don't like require like a decent level of education from the schools in those communities. We talked about this. I mean, if you're watching the show and you're not in Baltimore, but here in Baltimore, what was it, Mondawmin High School?
At Mondawmin Mall. But you're talking...
when we were talking about down on Central Avenue, what's the high school down there?
Dunbar
High School. So the Dunbar High School has like a 60% dropout rate. And every single kid in the school is...
And that's one of the better schools.
Is not proficient at reading, math, or science, right? This particular school is in the city of Baltimore and it's governed by Democrats. So if we left Dunbar High School and we head out west on Central Avenue, 5, 6 miles, 7 miles up the road, we're going to run into Loch Raven. And in Loch Raven, we're going to run into either Loch Raven High School or Delaney Valley High School. This area is also governed by Democrats. Okay. Yeah, and that's the graduation rate in these schools is in the high 90%. Every kid is proficient at reading, math, and science. And there are plenty of black children that are in these schools, which just so happen to be proficient at reading, math, and science. So what does that tell us? It tells us that Democrats actually know how to educate kids. And black kids are actually educatable. Is that a word? That's a word.
It is today.
So it's telling you that what's going on in our cities across this country is intentional, period. And there's not a governor in this entire country that doesn't have the power at the executive branch, the gubernatorial office of their state, to stop it in its entirety. The governors of the states are the chief executive officers with all the executive powers of a state are vested in them. And they seem to always, like you have plenty of red states. So Republicans are always like, look at the Democrats. You know what I mean? They always pointing the fingers, but what are they actually doing about it? There's plenty of cities that are governed by Democrats where you have a majority Republican legislature and a Republican governor.
Right.
What in the hell, is that jurisdiction not under that governor's authority?
That's right.
Of course it is. What that governor is saying.
What's allowed in because what's allowed in Montgomery County is not going to be allowed in Baltimore City. Mm-hmm. What's allowed in Baltimore County is not going to be allowed in Prince George's County. And this is what we're seeing. We see this and I'm naming it in Maryland, but you can do the same thing in any state. If you live in Alabama, what's going to be allowed in Mobile is not going to be allowed in Montgomery. You know, and in Georgia, you can do the same thing. If you live in Cobb County, Georgia, same things are going to be allowed. Not in Atlanta, though.
Here's a real life example of what you're talking about. So when I bought my first house, shortly after getting home from active duty, it was in Bowley's Quarters, Middle River, Maryland. And I bought a townhouse. And it just so happened the first weekend that I was moving into my house, so I was coming and going a lot. Well, it was the time, like if, local Baltimore, this is actually a national news story. The guy, Joe Palzinski, went off on a shooting spree. Like couldn't handle his emotions when him and his girlfriend split up. She was staying with a coworker. He busted in the house, shot up the coworker and her husband. kidnapped her, took her back up to, east side of Baltimore, shot up some other people in a carjacking, and then he was barricaded in a house. But before all that was happening, like he was loose in Boley's quarters, right? So I grew up in the O'Donnell Heights. There were shootings all the time. This is the first time I ever got my ass pulled over where they wanted to check my trunk. You know what I mean? To see if coming and going where the shooter was. But just 8 miles up Eastern Avenue into the city, like when those kind of shootings happen, they're not stopping everything to go find the shooter.
At all.
You know what I mean? They probably complaining that they got to do the report. But in this particular capacity, a predominantly white neighborhood, I guess is a good way to say it, but it's not even so much about, it could be a predominantly black neighborhood in a good area that doesn't constitute or consist of projects and things of that nature, and it's still going to be a problem. Because it's all mixed in, like you have good areas, like, I don't know, I guess if you have, there are apartment complexes and things where there's a lot of Section 8 housing that might be, 60% black, 40% white, or whatever the difference, whatever. But we know for a fact that the projects in our inner cities, you know what I mean? Like, good luck finding a white person there, even working a job. You know what I mean? So with all that said, it's just all you have to do. And I say this all the time, like I'm not the smartest guy in any room, but my brain works in a logical context. I look at what's logical and I look at what's within reason and I can form an opinion. I can see things for what most people can't see. How in the world do we not realize that what's going on in our cities is absolutely intentional, period? So that means that our government, if it's intentional, they are purposefully oppressing our black neighbors. This shit's got to stop. The revolution blueprint, like this why this man's here too.
Let's bring it
black
back.
And white
Let's
together, red, white, and black. We are going to liberate this country, and black people are finally going to get some constitutional liberties behind the success of our movement. We're going to end all that bullshit. At least that's the plan. And it sounds crazy in theory,
but and Rob and I always have to commend my co-host because if you haven't gotten the book, go to Amazon, get the Revolution Blueprint, and you'll understand the premise for everything that we're doing, everything that we're saying, and what the mission is. When we look at the first thing that has to happen is people have to know. And so when we're telling everybody, if you're watching this podcast, share it, send it to your friends, send it to your family, send it to everybody, because what you're going to hear is truth. What you're going to hear is everything that's, I'm going to make up another word too, Googleable, right?
You made that word up before. It's a good word, dude. I like it.
Right? It's that everything that we're saying is factual. Everything we're saying you can research. Mm-hmm. Everything that we're saying, everything that's in the book, every show that you watch, go back and go to our YouTube page, go to a YouTube channel, watch all the previous episodes, keep watching, share.
Right.
But because the thing is people, what they say, we suffer for lack of knowledge, right? Our people suffer for lack of knowledge. And so once they say people do better when they know better, but you also have to move different, right? In order to get something different, you got to do something different. And so what we're saying is that different is you have to rise up against whether you're red, blue, Democrat, Republican.
We got to get the red and the blue thing the hell out of this. We're all Americans, so that's why we're red, white, and black. So it's all our two races make up the predominant races and all the racial issues in this country that's been created by oppressive government for us. And we don't have enough time to get back into that because we got to wrap it up. But, all in all, we are not always right about everything. So we've coined the term that we're not always right, but we're mostly right all the time. So you might be able to find something where statistically we were a little bit off or something like that. But either way, the bottom line is we care. We care about ending the tyranny. We care about the future. Look, if it would just stop, if the tyranny stopped right here and it was not going to get any worse, maybe we could manage. But it's progressively getting worse year after year, decade after decade. And some of us who are older, we can look back 20, 30 years ago and man, if we could just be in that time.
Right.
If we could just go back to before 9/11, America was still good. We had a lot of corruption, a lot of shit and spending and all that kind of crap, but we were still, we mostly had a free country and the Constitution was respected. It's my contention that I contend without question that 9/11 was the day that our country was surrendered to global powers, period. And everything that's transpired since 9/11 has been to weaken and break the United States of America. We're going to get into that in the new show. It's a wrap. We ran a little over today, but I'm Rob Iobi. This is Will Hanna. This is the Revolution Blueprint. We thank you for joining us, and get you a copy of the book. Stay with us.
Amazon.
We're coming back. We're just getting started. We're going to keep hitting harder and harder and harder every week. Thanks. Take care. That's a wrap.